So what's the difference between a podcast host and a podcast host? Hello, I'm Mark Steadman, and I'm from the podcast hosting company Podiant, and I want to bring you actionable advice that you can apply to your podcast today. Now, we're going to get pretty meta, pretty specific today, because we are talking about the hosting of podcasts, which is the technical aspect of keeping your files online. So hosting, it's an old school sort of technical term that you're probably familiar with, and it essentially means keeping your files online in the cloud, as we might refer to it now. If you're familiar with hosting a website, if you've ever done that, then you will pay a company or a service a monthly or an annual fee to keep those files online for you. Some services include a content management system. That's things like Squarespace and WordPress.com. And then you've got others which just do the technical underpinnings. So a podcast host differs in that, yes, we keep your audio files online, but we also keep track of the number of downloads for each episode. We also provide something called an RSS feed, which is a file that podcast apps will check. If you don't have an RSS feed, you don't have a podcast. And we'll talk about RSS and subscription in a little bit as well. Modern podcast hosts also provide a website for your podcast as well. Each episode should have its own web page. You have an embeddable player for the episode, and we make a point of pushing people to subscribe to your podcast by having lots of links and buttons to help people subscribe in their app of choice. A host also helps you distribute your podcast to apps and directories. So now let's talk about subscription. This is a word that we use, subscribing to a podcast. Again, it's a hangover from more technical days of podcasting. And it essentially just means plugging an RSS feed into an app. That app checks the RSS feed regularly to say, is there a new episode of this podcast? Once there is, that RSS feed is updated with the URL to the episode's audio file. Now, as we've moved the industry on a little bit, we tend to favor other kind of words now. So Apple tends to use the word listen because it feels a bit less technical. It feels less like there's a barrier to entry. And then you've got Spotify who's used the word follow. And I tend to like a word like follow because it suggests an ongoing relationship, whereas listen kind of feels like it's something you do once. But that's just my personal opinion. So now let's look at the life cycle of an episode. So you upload an audio file, you write your metadata and your title, and you set a release date, which can be in the past, present, or the future. And then once that release date is hit, your RSS feed, that file on the internet, is updated with a link to download that MP3 file. Podcast apps check the feed, see the new episode, download it. They might check more or less often, depending on all sorts of different factors, how popular your podcast is, how often it's updated, for example. So analytics is a big part of the service that hosting companies provide. Now, what that essentially entails is trying to count how many times a particular MP3 file was downloaded. Now, that's not the same as knowing how many times it was played, or even if it was played. All we can really know is when it was downloaded, what file it was downloaded, a little bit of information about the software that was used to download it, and the IP address, which we can use to infer a location. Some apps gather their own stats as well. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google, if you have accounts with them, then you can get an analytics dashboard from those apps. Spotify shares some of its data, but most of the other apps don't. They keep it siloed. The problem with some of that is that these in-app analytics, yes, they're more accurate, but they only show the picture for that specific app. So if that's not your most popular listening app for your podcast, it won't necessarily give you a good overview of how your listeners actually interact with your podcast. So finally then, when should you sign up for podcast hosting? My take is that I think you should do that when you have your first episode ready and at least 30 days before you're ready to go live. And we'll talk about why that's important in future videos. Speaking of future videos, there's lots more that you can get over at podiant.co/learn. We've got loads of resources there in text and video form to help you make better podcasts and attract more listeners. That is the job that we do. You can also, while you're there, check out a 14-day free trial of the Podiant podcast hosting service. And if you've got questions about this or about the service, you can find me and Podiant on Twitter at PodiantHQ, and you will find us on YouTube. Just search for us by name at Podiant, and our website is podiant.co. Thank you very much for watching this, and I will look forward to speaking to you in the next one. Take care.